I am opening the webinar right now.
Hi everyone, we're just going to give a couple of minutes so that everyone can join the webinar. So we'll probably give you until about 12:05 before we start the panel. Hi, welcome everyone who's new. We're going to give a couple more minutes for a couple more people to join with the fixed link, and then we'll get started. Clearly, I should have gotten a cool waiting playlist like Nina has for all the other events. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I'm Erin. I'm the Director of External Affairs this year for the Policy Hackathon, And I'm really excited to start out this panel this afternoon on science communication. We have a great set of panelists, but first I have a couple of announcements for you guys. The first one is if you could please fill out the media release form that we put in the announcement section by 10 a.m. tomorrow before the judging starts. That would be great. And the second one is that we will be using Q&A for this panel. So if you have questions for the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A and we'll answer them in the second part of the panel. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand it right over to Fushali for an introduction of the panel and the panelists.
Thanks, Erin. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of technical difficulty. Great, it's great to be here today with Farah and Emily. I'll start off with introducing the two of them first. So we have Farah Kaiser, a genomics researcher and science writer. She takes part in various science policy and communication efforts to help build an engaging and inclusive science culture. Farah currently serves on the Canada Chief Science Advisors Youth Council. Farah is also one of the co-founders of the Toronto Science Policy Network. Emily Calandrelli is an MIT engineer turned science communicator and the host and co-executive producer of Netflix's Emily's Wonderlab. Emily is the executive producer and Emmy-nominated host of Fox's Exploration Outer Space and a correspondent on Netflix's Bill Nye Saves the World. So I'll ask our panelists to tell us a little bit more about themselves and also answer a question we asked them both. The question was, provide an example of a groan-worthy instance of science communication in popular media headlines, and how could the headline have been better framed? So over to you, Emily.
Well, hello, everyone. Good morning for me, but good afternoon for you, I guess. I'm based in California here, but as she mentioned, my name is Emily Calandrelli. I went to MIT from 2010 to 2013 doing Aeroastro and TPP. Right after that, it was a very weird serendipitous moment. I got contacted from a production company that asked if I wanted to be the host of a new space show. I'd never done anything in TV before, but they had found me online, mostly because my undergrad I went to West Virginia University, had promoted me a lot as a woman in engineering and from West Virginia who was like doing well in engineering. They sort of treated me like a poster child. And so when they Googled woman in aerospace, I came up in one of their Google searches. And so from there, I started doing exploration outer space. And then I went on to Bill Nye Saves the World. And then most recently, my own Netflix show, Emily's Wonderlab, which is geared toward ages 5 and up, where I do science experiments with kids. But I work pretty hard to keep my foot both in the science media world geared toward kids, but also in the professional world of talking about science and technology developments in the space industry for adults as well. And so what else? Yeah, I'm an author of a children's chapter book series, The Ada Lace Adventures. And then now I do my science communication on all forms of social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok now, apparently. And so I would say the groan-worthy headline that I see, often you have these people who get famous on TikTok who just regurgitate these clickbaity headlines, and they get tons of views because they're clickbaity for a reason. They're really captivating. And so I would say the most groan-worthy headlines that I see are the ones that sound so fascinating. And that is, of course, the reason they were written that way. But one in particular that comes up almost every month is an asteroid is coming to Earth. An asteroid is going to intersect Earth. And it's always like, will it or won't it? Will we all die? And of course, they want you to click the link to get the real facts of like, oh, there's only a 1 in 10,000 chance that it's actually going to happen. And even if it does, it's going to burn up in the atmosphere. So it's like, it's a non-news story, but those are the ones that I see the most that people talk about a lot. I think even Neil deGrasse Tyson mentioned it recently where there was like an asteroid that might hit Earth the day before the election, hell 2020. And everybody is like sharing that like wildfire. And it turns out that it's about the size of a refrigerator. So it would absolutely just burn up in our atmosphere, and it would be like, oh, look at that shooting star, how pretty. And so these headlines don't really explain what would actually happen. To put that in perspective, the Chelyabinsk meteor that you may remember, that was like 56 feet long. And so that one didn't result in any deaths, but it caused a little bit of damage. And this one is instead the size of a refrigerator. So anyways, I think that's the one that I see the most that comes up like every month.
Great. And Farah.
So hi, my name is Farah. I recently completed a Master of Science degree, and I'm actually tuning in from Canada, so perhaps different geographical location. How I got started in science communication was, I think, a bit of an accident. I was kind of doing science communication before knowing what it was. When I was in my undergraduate degree, I was going to class as always, but I also was writing for my campus newspaper. I was writing for my features section. I accidentally ended up being elected as the features editor in my second year. I don't know why they let me, but it kind of gave me an opportunity to kind of focus more on science stories, writing about science and covering the cool science that was happening on my campus. And when I went on to graduate studies, I kind of wanted to do more. I had noticed some common issues that kept coming up when I was doing coverage. So I noticed there was a lack of diversity in STEM. I noticed that science was inaccessible either due to jargon or it's locked behind paywalls. So I thought that maybe science communication and outreach was kind of the way forward. So I took part in a lot of outreach to different communities, whether it was youth or adults in the general public. And I did a lot of public speaking and so on. But I noticed that there was kind of a trend. Like every year we would have women in STEM panels. Every year we would talk about the same issues again and again. And not a lot was being done to kind of move the dial towards actual change. And I realized that science policy is actually one of the ways to get that change. So I started learning more about science policy. Science policy, at least in Canada, it's still very limited to people in the government and people who are aware of what it is. And that's kind of common to a lot of countries. So I actually ended up co-founding a student science policy group at my university. And we kind of provided this platform for students, researchers, and the local community to learn about and engage in science policy, whether that was through workshops, talks, or like leading initiatives. For example, in the last year, we led a survey kind of about what the impacts of COVID-19 are on graduate students. I say last year, but it was 5 months ago. It feels like a year. But in short, what I've kind of learned throughout this journey was I started off doing communication and writing, and then I explored outreach before I kind of realized that it's going to be a combination of all of this that's going to be needed for change. Today, I'm a genomics researcher, and I'm also a science writer writing about things like COVID-19, usually a lot of COVID-19 these days for outlets like Forbes. As for the question about headlines, so I read a lot of news. There are a lot of headlines that bother me. I think what frustrates me the most is that headline writers, they have like 5 or 6 words and they just have to cram it to get you to click. And sometimes they make overreaching conclusions. For example, in the early days of the pandemic, we saw a lot of the SARS-CoV-2 virus came from bats, it came from pangolins, when the actual study being cited just suggested, hey, a part of the genome matches to a part of a bat's genome. So it's just like a lot of overreaching headlines. I understand where the news reporters are coming from, but it just contributes to a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of misinformation too. So yeah.
Thank you. So Farah, I know you spoke to this a little bit, but my next question was going to be, how did you get started on science communication? And maybe you can speak to how people who are interested in the area can get started along the same lines.
Yep. So as I mentioned, I kind of started in undergrad where I had no idea what science communication was, but I just really liked science writing and I loved listening and talking to different people and kind of sharing their science through the campus newspaper. But there are honestly so many ways to get started and it really depends on what you're interested in. For example, there's science writing, there's science outreach, there's public speaking, there's science policy. And these are all very broad, fancy terms. So what it can actually look like in person is perhaps you're part of your local outreach group and you're going and doing outreach to high school communities, or maybe you're writing for a blog, maybe you're tweeting on social media. Maybe you're using Instagram like Science Sam to kind of share what you're doing in the lab. So it can be very overwhelming to know where to start because there are so many opportunities. I would kind of just say like what you're drawn to, like go for it, explore it. I never planned out what I was doing. Planning always helps and it's always good to be intentional, but I kind of just followed, hey, this seems interesting. Hey, I think I want to learn more. So I was just being open to the opportunities has helped me get to where I am today. So I would just say explore. There's a lot of opportunities out there.
Great. And how about you, Emily? How did you get started? And what would you say to people who are interested in this area and want to be science communicators?
Yeah, I think the first like professional thing that I did was I started writing for TechCrunch as a tech journalist and covering the space industry. And I did that for about a year. And so that taught me a lot about science communication to sort of a general tech audience who may not know the inner workings of the space industry, and really trying to hone in on here are the facts, but this is the context. This is why it's interesting. This is why it's groundbreaking. This is why you should be paying attention to this. And then I would say for me, building up my platform on social media was the best thing that I've done. Because now, and this is like a very practical piece of advice that this is just something that I have noticed personally, is that policymakers now care about what I think about their policies. And they will reach out to me to want to discuss their policies, and so that I will promote them on social media. And that was a very interesting thing that started happening recently. Like people in governors' races started reaching out to me to discuss their policies. People who are working for Biden's like climate activism started reaching out to me, and like all of these things that I'm like, oh, wow. So this is what the power of a platform can do. This is another way that someone can influence policy because they want to get their word out there. To do that, they need people like you who are good at communicating science to a general audience and maybe have a platform where people will listen. And in order for you to want to communicate that policy, it needs to be a policy worth communicating. So that's certainly one of them. I would say my advice to anybody who's interested in just starting that is to start early, and just, it's one of those trial and error things, because you're not going to get it perfectly the first few times. It feels like a 10,000 hour skill set where you just keep trying at communicating something that's in your wheelhouse, something that you find personally interesting, because chances are if you find it interesting, there's going to be an audience out there who also finds it interesting. You can look to see who else is in that field already doing this and their style of communication. For me, I think the most interesting aspect of this is that we are all different types of people. We all have different personalities, and we shouldn't be afraid to bring that side of us to science communication, because that human element is what makes the science interesting. Because anybody can read about the science or the technology from an article. You adding your human element, why are you personally excited or irritated or confused or whatever? What is the human emotion that brings you to want to talk about this news piece or this science policy or whatever it is? Because that's what draws people to want to continue to follow you and listen to you and learn from you.
Great, thank you. So speaking of platforms and building on the theme of equity, that's the theme of the MIT Policy Hackathon. Emily, how do you work to bring in audiences who are underrepresented in these conversations and make them feel comfortable? And does this have more to do with how you frame a problem or the general form of outreach?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to do this. For example, one of the things that we do for Exploration Outer Space, so this is my show on Saturday mornings. It's geared toward an adult audience, high school students and up. I've had professors use it in classes before. And one of the things that we do to try to make that more inclusive is that we get to choose which experts we highlight in the show. And at NASA and in the aerospace industry, it is not super diverse. It is mostly whites and mostly male. And so we put ourselves to task to change the demo of what we highlight in the show. Because we could choose to say, let's make it a very representative demo of what you see in the field, or we can hand select experts who represent different types of people who will be watching the show. And so we have numbers that we try to hit in each season. And we try to do it in each episode as well, where we try to highlight many different types of voices from people from many different types of backgrounds, so that people who are watching the show can see someone who kind of looks like them talking about the science. Because obviously representation is so important. There's just something about listening to somebody who kind of looks like you that makes everything that they're saying all the more relatable. I think the other thing is that it's important to realize that sometimes you are not the best communicator for a certain type of problem or a certain type of audience. And we need to be cognizant of the times where we don't necessarily need to take up space in a certain issue. Like me as a white woman, I try to be more cognizant of that as I talk about lots of different issues that may not affect me directly. There could be someone else that would be a better proponent of a solution or a better communicator of a policy, where I can maybe just lend my platform to somebody else. And these are things that I can always get better at, and I'm always learning. And I think that sometimes it's hard for us to realize that we are not always the best person to communicate something. Like maybe somebody else is going to be better at that. And it's okay to sort of give them the space to do that and just try to amplify their voices instead of figuring out the best way for you to do it.
Right. Farah, do you want to speak to how you work with bringing in audiences who are underrepresented in these conversations as well?
Mm-hmm. So as a science writer, one of the things I try to prioritize is having a diversity of voices in the sources that I cite, the sources that I quote, and the studies that I cover. So a lot of focus in science journalism is it's fast paced, especially now with COVID-19. So you always want to get an expert who can get back to you in 2 minutes. And that's often actually happens to be people who have more time and more resources that they can get back to you that quickly. So kind of being able to get in touch with perhaps a woman, perhaps a person of color, that's going to take more emails, just reaching out more. So for me, working to bring in audiences who are underrepresented just means adjusting my timelines, being mindful of the constraints that sources may be working with, and just budgeting in that time. Like I might have to email 3 or 4 times before I find a person of color to quote, and that's okay because that's what I want to prioritize. But in terms of general outreach, I would also recommend going to where your audience is. So a lot of times people host events to perhaps engage students from marginalized communities, but how are those students going to make it to that event? How are they going to commute to the university? Is there transit coverage to make it to the university? So sometimes heading to the community center, heading to where the students or where your audience is can really help in making sure that your event is actually reaching who you say that you're reaching. And I'm going to echo Emily here. Yeah, sometimes you are not the messenger. Don't take up space if you're not the best person to do so. And I would also add, don't recreate the wheel. So there are guidelines and best practices for how to approach difficult topics or how to engage with specific communities like faith-based communities. So definitely check out those resources and speak to the people who are doing the work already and learn from them. For example, I was recently writing a grant application to teach a science communication course, and I noticed that I'm not really the expert on community engagement with a specific community. So instead, I reached out within my network and I was like, I think this person's a better fit. And I asked if they would be willing to help out and if they wanted to teach a component of the course, they were happy to. And that way I was able to amplify the effort of someone who's working this field and also make sure that what I'm teaching and what I'm delivering is appropriate and is being led by an expert. And the last thing I just want to acknowledge is imposter syndrome. So there's a difference between not being the right messenger and not feeling qualified to take on a particular opportunity. For example, I just graduated with a master's in July, and I still have to kind of remind myself that I am an expert. I do know what I'm speaking about, and just being able to differentiate between this is something that isn't a good fit for me versus this is actually a good fit for me, and I'm just a little nervous about taking it on. So yeah, I think framing. Yeah.
I wanted to just like, yes, cheer you on that one, because especially as someone who's trying to get more women and people of color, BIPOC individuals in my show, I often have to do a lot of like encouraging to women in particular that like, let me tell you, this average white dude feels very confident in talking about something that he's definitely not an expert on. So you should feel comfortable talking about this thing that is very relevant to the work that you do. And I have to do that way more often to women, for women, to encourage them to speak out on this topic, because if they're not an exact perfect expert on something, they'll be like, oh, no, that's not my area of expertise. And I'm like, no, we're not looking for someone who has a PhD in this particular topic. Like, you are very well suited for this topic for us. But I think it's good to recognize that happens more often with women especially. So be cognizant of that as someone who may fall into that category.
Great. So along the similar line of engagement, Emily, we know you've traveled the world as a professional speaker at a number of events. How do you have conversations with audiences that are less welcoming? And I'll also pull up a question that's come up on the Q&A. It's related to this as well. So how do you have conversations with less welcoming audiences? And how do you define effective science communication? And does that definition change when the communicator has to convince a skeptical audience of the validity of science?
Yeah, so I feel like my most relevant experience in this area is anytime I talk to people in West Virginia about various science topics. And the thing about West Virginia is that it is #1 in the entire country when it comes to the fewest percentage of constituents that believe that global warming is happening. And as a science communicator, talking about climate change in this environment can be very challenging. But I love West Virginia and I love the people of West Virginia. And so I have tried to look into this a bit further. And what I've learned is that oftentimes when somebody is denying the experts of a certain area of science, like climate change experts, it's often not about the education. It's often not about the science at all. The problem is not simple as lack of education. It's a very, very nuanced problem. So in West Virginia, for example, the coal industry just is so wealthy and has so much power in the state. They invest hundreds of thousands of dollars into grants for teachers to teach coal lessons designed by the coal industry. And so as a kid, as a young age, you are, I don't want to say brainwashed, but brainwashed into thinking that coal is the best thing to ever happen to the state, and that anybody who is working against that to maybe create environmentally friendly policies is no friend of West Virginia, is no friend to your family. And as someone who, my dad lost his job, he worked at a coal company. He lost his job because the coal industry was going under. So I understand the emotion that is involved here. There's a lot of pride involved, but it's mostly because people have lost their jobs. And the other bad thing that's going on in West Virginia is we have an opioid epidemic where people lose their jobs, they start to rely on opioids, and then you have this entire other problem. So these people, these families are dealing with this and they need something to blame. And they see these environmentally friendly policies that sound like they're bad for the coal industry, even though the coal industry isn't doing well because of cheaper market forces from cheaper alternatives. But they want to blame these environmentally friendly policies that don't seem very friendly to them. And so for them, it's very self-preserving to believe that climate change isn't happening. So you wouldn't get to that. You wouldn't really understand the economic aspect of that unless you started to be more empathetic. So, and listen to everything behind I don't believe that climate change exists. So for me, when I talk about climate change, first, empathy is something that is incredibly important, and listening to why they don't believe in climate change. And I use the word believe intentionally because many scientists will take issue with that, because climate change and science is not really something you believe, it's something that you figure out and then at some point you know it. But I do think it manifests itself psychologically as a belief. But when I talk to people who don't believe in climate change, I try to talk to them from a perspective that maybe they would be interested in. So there's a lot of research in political psychology on grouping people into different categories. And one of the most powerful categories is if you identify as a conservative or if you identify as a liberal. And depending on what you identify as, you prioritize different values. Values like, for example, you more highly value things like caring for the environment or protection from harm, or on a conservative angle, you value national security and you value the military, and you value these things differently. You prioritize them differently. And so when I talk to a conservative audience about climate change, I'll frame climate change as a national security issue, as something that is putting the lives of our military at risk, or purity is also something that conservatives care deeply about. So keeping our air, water, and land clean, keep making our country clean is something that resonates more highly with conservatives. And so anyways, just framing the argument from a perspective that they care about, not what you think they should care about. Yes, we should care about protecting the environment and making sure that our world isn't up in flames, but that's not an angle that is going to speak very highly to them. So being cognizant of what they care about and trying to frame your argument around that.
That's very interesting. Farah, do you have anything to say on speaking to audiences who are not necessarily very friendly or welcoming?
I mean, I feel like Emily hit it perfectly. The only thing I would add is, I think it really depends on the situation. For example, if you're having a hard conversation in person versus social media, it's different. On social media, it's harder to pick up on tone, and it's easier for folks to become more argumentative or block, report, mute. Versus in person, it's easier sometimes to have a conversation, to just open up that line of open communication, just listen to what the other person's saying, acknowledge their valid points, and kind of have a constructive dialogue. While in social media, sometimes people are open to questions. Sometimes they do want to flag which part they were worried about or they wanted to know more about, while sometimes it can be a little destructive. So I would just say that it depends on the situation, and you do have the decision on whether to engage or not. So for example, and sometimes I've written about topics like climate change, I've written about different aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, I've written about women in science. So the COVID-19 coverage has not sparked a lot of hard conversations, but somehow the women in science pieces have. And it's been very interesting that different topics can evoke like different reactions. So I would just echo everything Emily said: empathy, having conversation, trying to relate to where the person is coming from, and listening to people, I think, really is key.
Great. Farah, we know you write a lot about science and science stories, and it's in an effort to engage non-technical audiences. How do you strike a balance between simplifying complex ideas and illuminating important details? And along the same lines, I think we have one more question from the audience, which is, what are the important things to remember while communicating science and policy effectively through data analysis and visualization to those with a non-technical background?
So about the simplifying complex ideas, I usually use 3 questions to kind of guide that. So the first one is, who is your audience? Why are they there at that location, or why are you approaching them? What values, beliefs, concerns, political beliefs do they have? So really understanding your audience and where they're coming from is kind of the first step in framing your message and deciding what to include. The second question usually is, what do you want your audience to understand? So what's kind of the background information that they need to understand your message? For example, if I'm talking about my research, I'm in genomics. So the first question I usually have is, what is DNA? How large is our DNA? So you want to have enough relevant details to set up the context for you to deliver your message or key point. And then the last question I usually ask is, what do I want my audience to remember? You can't share everything, unfortunately. People are only going to read so much of your piece. People are only going to scroll past your tweet, or you may only have 3 minutes with a policymaker. So you really want to decide, these are the 3 key messages that I want to share. This is the supporting information that's going to help me share those 3 key messages. And this is how I'm going to fine tune my message to my audience. So I would say, who is your audience? What do you want your audience to understand? And what do you want your audience to remember? Specific to policy folks, I would recommend that you want to make it as easy as possible for policymakers to digest your message. So for example, if you're heading into a meeting with a policymaker, have your key messages ready, but perhaps have a policy brief handy so that if that conversation goes well, you can just slide over this short policy brief that goes into more detail about what you're saying. I've forgotten the second question now, so I hope.
The second question was, I'll just read it, it's no problem. What are the most important things to remember while communicating science and policy effectively through data analysis and visualizations to those with a non-technical background?
Mm-hmm. So about data analysis, I would say you need to flip the order. So when you're writing a manuscript, you usually go intro, method, results, discussion. But when you're writing a policy brief, you want that key takeaway first. Then you might talk about methods a little, but really it's more about context, background, and the key takeaway. The methods and the really nitty-gritty of the details, they can go in your appendix, or you might want to exclude them entirely because you have very limited time with the policymaker, and that data analysis is not as interesting. Data visualization is important. It's much easier to look at a simple figure versus a list of numbers. So keep it short and keep it brief are my 2 tips.
That's great. Emily, how do you strike balance between complex ideas for a non-technical audience and eliminating important details?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Farah said, it's basically, and for me, the way that I think of the question, know your audience, for me, that's always age, because I work on various projects that deal with 5-year-olds and then middle schoolers, and then people who are college students, but very early in their career, and then professionals. And so I have to really figure out how to hone the same message, and also the tone of that message for me changes depending on the age as well. I think when I was at TPP, Farah, you were talking about instead of kind of like bearing the lead at first and then at the end telling your conclusion. That was one of those like light bulb moments for me when I was at MIT doing TPP, because when you think about storytelling, you're sort of like, well, let me keep you interested so that eventually you read to the end and then you get the punchline. And that's not how you're supposed to do anything related to science policy. It's like, put the punchline first so that they know that they should actually read this. And then I think the other framework that I remember being really useful is cost benefit analysis, being very honest about, there are costs to everything, and then there is a payoff to everything. And so all too often, especially in very bipartisan politics, you kind of want to frame something as like purely good or something as purely bad. And in reality, everything has these nuances. And then in addition to that, having like a short-term thinking of the issue and a long-term thinking, especially when it comes to policy, the short-term one is really important, because especially when it comes to science stuff, because a lot of science related things, it's a long-term investment. You're investing now so that you get a payoff many, many years down the road. The challenge with that is that they are not likely going to be, they can't use that benefit to help them get reelected. So really communicating short-term benefits clearly is really important, but also having that long-term effect there as well, because so much of science has a long-term effect. But yeah, there's a reason why Trump wanted to land on the moon in 2024. That 2024 wasn't like a technical number that they came up with because all of the technology would be ready by 2024. So finding ways to make it interesting to policymakers from that angle can be really, really important as well.
Great, thank you. I'll take another question from the audience that's related to the same topic. Leah says, I used to be a policymaker in the US State Department. One of the challenges when making policy was often getting scientific information distilled to a level that was useful to our agency. To what extent is it scientists' responsibility to explain what they're doing succinctly? And what can science communicators do to summarize and aggregate research so that it can influence policy decisions?
I mean, I wish that in engineering and in science, we had communication classes, and maybe now they do, but in any of my courses, that was not a skill set that was considered valuable, because I mean, maybe it was, but we weren't graded on it. We weren't evaluated on it. It wasn't included as a mandatory part of our curriculum, and it absolutely should be, because we get to a point where we are training scientists and engineers to do very important work, and they don't have the skill set to be able to communicate that to others. And so I am incredibly thankful for the scientists who do dedicate their time to science communication. I've heard from people in academia that sometimes that's looked down upon, because some people in your professional world will see that as time that you should have been spending on your research, or time that you should have been spending doing something related to whatever. I mean, I would argue that that is related to your job. It's a very important part of your job, but it's not, I think the current, I don't think it's valued as much as it should be. And so, Emily, could you talk a little bit about science communication, especially with the goal of fanning interest for children and preteens? So anyways, putting a button on that, I think that it should be something that scientists are trained to do, because it's a very important skill set. Science communicators can help that in the meantime, because now I don't consider myself a scientist, because I'm not a professional scientist, but I think that it's incredibly valuable for science communicators to be able to find ways to distill that very important work to the general public, and especially to policymakers. But talking a bit about science communication, especially when the goal is to create an interest for children and preteens. Again, I think representation is the most important thing. The story that I've been telling recently is for many years, for 6 years or so, I've been pitching science shows to large science networks. And often I would get the feedback that the vast majority of our audience is male. And so we just don't know if they would relate well to a female host. And one particular network loved the show that I was pitching and asked if I had a boyfriend or something that could co-host the show with me. And so it's very frustrating feedback to hear. But if you look at the lineup of science shows on major science networks and you look at the hosts of those shows, they look remarkably similar. And so you have this really unfortunate feedback loop where these large science networks, they look at their audience, they say it's okay, it's mostly male. So they choose male hosts and male driven shows. So like male producers, male directors, male writers, all of that. And then when you have that, then you get a mostly male audience, and then they use that audience to justify doing more male driven shows. And it's just like, wait, I have an idea of how you might be able to get more women to watch your program. And I think so many times they treat women as this like niche audience, and we're like more than half of the world's population. So anyways, I would say representation is incredibly important, because that's just the way that you reach people who aren't traditionally reached.
Great, thank you. Farah, with your work with Toronto Science Policy Network, can you speak to what science communicators can do to summarize and aggregate research so it can influence policy decisions?
Mm-hmm. So I think in general, science communicators can help lead training and create resources when paid to do so, to help train scientists to improve their science communication skills. I also think that funding agencies and institutions, they need to recognize science communication as an important skill set and dedicate funding so that this training can happen, so that everyone values this skill set as something that's part of your toolbox of being a scientist. I do think that it is a scientist's responsibility, that you should be able to explain your research to a general member of the public, and I'm using public very broadly, whether it is your own family, a policymaker, or someone who's just curious. because a lot of our research is funded by taxpayer money, and it is your responsibility to not only do your research, do it effectively and with integrity, but to also share what's happening within the lab with the broader publics. So it's definitely the scientist's responsibility, but there needs to be a lot more support and help in order for scientists to even be able to do that. If the Toronto Science Policy Network, we started it just because people weren't aware of science policy and people weren't aware of how to even use their science to inform decision making or how policy plays a role in science. So this is a student-run group. We've been fortunate to receive funding support from our university, and we've been able to keep going. But the thing is, there needs to be more of a recognition for the work that students, science communicators, scientists are kind of doing to bring science communication into the community, but it's not sustainable unless there's widespread support, especially when it comes to money.
Right, so along the same lines of supporting science communication, we have a question from Robbie from the audience. The question is, say I work at an organization and we really want to expand support and public understanding of a complicated area of science that has far-reaching societal effects, but limited public understanding. How could I go about engaging science communicators with a platform to support us? Farah, if you want to take it.
Sure. I mean, the first thing would be you should probably sit down and kind of brainstorm what your goals are. So are you hoping to help deliver policy? Do you want to run an awareness campaign? Do you want specific people in one community to know, or do you want it to be all across the US? So really distilling down what your goal is, and then you can kind of figure out who you want to reach out to. Is it really an individual science communicator that you want, or do you want an advocacy organization or perhaps a team of marketing experts? So knowing your goal will help you kind of design your approach. I would also say this is a service, so you definitely want to apply to grants, apply for funding so that you can hire experts to help you deliver this campaign effectively. And I would also say, don't forget about yourself. You can also, like as Emily mentioned, build a platform and run a grassroots campaign yourself. It just really involves sitting down and thinking about your goals and who the best messenger is and how to go about it effectively.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to speak to that?
I have nothing to add. That covered it perfectly.
Perfect. We can take another question from the audience. How do you navigate imposter syndrome and your confidence in your expertise as a woman if you're working in a space surrounded by men, plus lacking the support of women or encouraging individuals? Either of you.
You're in space, Emily. Go for it.
Yeah, I there's no good answer for this. I think the higher you get in your career, there will always be some level of imposter syndrome, because there will always be somebody else above you that you can compare yourself to and be like, well, they know way more than I do. There's always going to be somebody who knows way more than you do. And I think that that is good to keep in mind, that comparing yourself to others is not super helpful or healthy. For me, it's definitely been doing things more frequently. I get more confidence at that specific skill set. So whether it's been being a host of a show or public speaking, for example, or even writing on technology. When I was first covering the space industry, I would be so anxious right before I would press the publish button, because I'd be like, do I have all my numbers right? Is this actually SpaceX's 9th time launching their reusable Falcon, whatever it was? I would be so anxious that somebody would find something wrong in my article and then tweet about it, and then my reputation would be over. But I think the more you do it, the more familiar you get with the work that you're doing. And you're like, oh no, I know this like the back of my hand. There will always be something that you're a little bit anxious about. But the more that I've done these things, the more comfortable I've become in these spaces and myself. And that goes with public speaking, that goes with operating in front of a camera, and that goes with writing about science and technology.
The part that you just said about hitting publish, I felt that very much. So when I published my first Forbes article, I was just like, oh my God, what if everyone hates it? But it was not the end of the world. In terms of imposter syndrome, so I've kind of realized that There are a lot of things that scare me, but it's in those situations when I'm doing something that scares me, I'm actually having the most fun. And when things go well, hopefully they go well, it's always very rewarding. Like you feel very happy that you took this risk. And even though it was scary as hell, you gave it a shot. So now I kind of actively go towards the things that scare the hell out of me because that's where I know that I'm going to learn and grow. And that's where I can continue to grow as a person too. So I am doing the opposite. I go directly for what scares me at this point. But in terms of general imposter syndrome, everyone has it. Some people are more vocal about it. Some people don't speak about it as much, but it's definitely there. I think it was Samantha Yamin who said it, that social media is kind of a highlight reel where people are sharing their successes. They're not sharing all the failures or how scared they are to post that certain achievement or opportunity or all the hours that went in. So everyone was where you were at that point. It's just about, we should all be more open about failures and talking about the things that scare us, but just acknowledge that you're not seeing all of the background work that's going in. And I feel imposter syndrome every day. I felt imposter syndrome when I realized Emily was a co-panelist on this panel. So I'm still here, even though it's terrifying me before I jumped on. But I would just say it's something that we're all dealing with. I wish there was more support in acknowledging it. And I know that conversations are beginning in academia and they're happening, whether it's with your supervisors or within your department, but it is a common thing. And I would just say, go do this thing that scares you. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't, but at least you'll learn something new.
And just to build off that, I think I love the part that you are talking about, like chasing things that you would feel that in, because you're right. That's where you're growing as a person in your career or whatever it is. I like the idea of like, if you are feeling imposter syndrome, that means you're in the right place. That's like a very exciting context to think about. Oh, and there was one other thing. What was I gonna, shoot, I'll think about it. I'll think of it later, but yeah, I was just, cheering you on with everything you were saying.
So speaking of hitting the publish button, given that there's so much information out there, the question from the audience is, how do we help our audience distinguish the nature of reliable information? And what is the look and feel of properly scientific information so that it is better recognized by the general public?
For me, I think this just means meeting your audience where they're at. And that can be through Instagram stories or on TikTok. The look and feel to me is just what type of media are the people that you want to reach consuming. Just bringing that back to everything that Farah has said is like, who is your audience? What is your goal? And if your goal is to reach Gen Z or whatever it is, like you need to go to where they're imbibing information. And that can be in non-traditional places where science isn't typically found. When I started doing science on TikTok, I was like, this is never going to work. And then there was a lot of people that like science on TikTok. And I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. So just going to where they're at can be the look and feel you might be looking for.
I completely agree. I also have mad respect for every scientist on TikTok. That is brilliant. And I love seeing science happening there. I would also add, if you're not comfortable with non-traditional spaces, you can still pitch pieces to outlets. You can write for blogs. You can write for your journal or your scientific organization's website. So there are non-traditional spaces, there are traditional spaces, and you can also create your own space by creating your own platform or blog. So there are a lot of options and it can be a little overwhelming on where to start, but there's no end to where you can go with your science communication.
Great. So in the last 7 minutes or so, because we're almost out of time, can you speak to any tips for concise communication that might help everyone who are participating in the policy hackathon as they put together their 3-minute policy pitches? And how can those who are participating in the hackathon take this experience forward in informed policy?
I mean, 3 minutes sounds like a short time, but it's actually a long time. So I took part in a 3-minute thesis to share my research. I ended up going pretty far. I ended up third in the competition, so it was pretty exciting. I think what I learned from that was you really have to sit and think about what you want to share. And you have to be kind of ruthless when you're editing your pitch. Do you really need that detail? Are you just saying that for fun? So I was explaining my research, genomics. What I ended up doing was I was like, this is what DNA is. I want to share how large DNA is. I use Harry Potter, the book series, as kind of an analogy for how large DNA is. So like connecting with your audience, giving them an analogy or a picture or a metaphor that will resound with them, and just being able to deliver that message. You have to be sharp with what you're doing because it's 3 minutes. Try to think of visuals like, do you have one slide? Can you paint a picture in your person's mind? That will help. And in terms of moving forward with this, so firstly, a lot of people don't show up for events like this. So kudos to you for participating and congratulations on taking a step that a lot of people wouldn't. You're going to make new friends in this, you're completing a project, and you're building some real life experience in what science communication policy is like. I would say at the end of this, the product that you've pitched, the policy that you've proposed, what can you do to move forward? Can you bring it to real life to policymakers? Can you turn this into a campaign, an awareness campaign? So like, think about the next steps. Or you might go in an opposite direction. You might have a different idea you want to pursue. I would just say, like, think about the skills and experiences you've learned from this. Maybe partner with some people you've met here and just keep going forward. And even if you don't act on it immediately, you'll probably draw on that experience in the years to come, whether you're communicating your science to scientific audience or non-scientific audience.
And yeah, I mean, I would just echo that. I think you're probably developing a really helpful mental framework through this, and just try to see if you can apply that same mental framework to other science issues that you come across in the future, because it is really, really helpful to start thinking about the things that you're reading about from many different angles. And that framework of thinking can help you think about it from a unique perspective that other people may not be seeing. And then the only other piece of advice I would say is, when you're giving your presentation, if you're giving your first final draft, then you're probably not doing it right. Making sure that you are iterating, that you've maybe given that presentation to a couple people who had time to digest it and tell you what they were confused by, tell you what they were really interested in, and just give your initial feedback. Because these types of things, to get good, you have to really iterate and get some feedback from somebody who has heard it from the first time. Remember that you have had time to digest everything that you're talking about, and it will read really differently to somebody who's never heard what you're about to say. So make sure that you test that on somebody who's never heard what you're about to say, so you can get that initial feedback and maybe change it a bit before your final presentation.
Can I add one tip? So if you're really feeling it, film yourself doing a practice round, and you will kind of begin to notice how many ums you say, or whether you're using your hands a lot. And it might make you question some things, but it will be very informative, and you might realize you want to do a few things differently.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left. And so any last thoughts maybe on what the most rewarding part of your jobs are?
I think just being on social media, it's a double-edged sword, because it's like sometimes the least favorite part of everything that I do. And sometimes it's the most favorite part of everything that I do, because you get to engage with the people who, like, the work that you're doing, it resonates with, and you get to find the people where it changed their mind on an issue, because that admittedly is a very rare thing to change anybody's mind. But when it does happen, you're just like, oh, that worked. And that's a really nice feeling. So I would say, if you are really interested in science communication in general, I think social media is such a great platform for it, because it allows you to iterate. You get immediate feedback oftentimes on how well something did. And so you can try new things, get creative, and just do it over and over and over again. Because getting your work on a big platform like Forbes, for example, is like one of those like high water moments in a career that is just absolutely incredible. But those are so hard to work toward, and people don't get those very often. But on social media, you can do this over and over and over again and build up your skill set, so that one day you might get something published in a place like Forbes. So I would say get on social media and do it like early and often.
Yes, I think joining Twitter in graduate school was the best decision I could have ever made. I know that Twitter may seem scary, but do it. You will learn so much from everyone. The other tip that I would add is just live in the moment. So this is really cool. This is a policy hackathon happening from your home. How many times is this going to happen? Hopefully not too much with COVID-19, but it's happening. So I would just say live in the moment and kind of enjoy what you're doing. It's happening now, and maybe there are things that you'll take forward in the future, and maybe you'll run your own policy hackathon. Who knows? So definitely enjoy this moment.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Farah and Emily. It's been amazing chatting with you both.
Yeah, thank you guys all so much for an amazing panel. That was fantastic. I'm so glad that all of you were able to join today. It was really a pleasure to have you here. And just a reminder to everyone again to please fill out the media release form by 10 a.m. tomorrow to stay eligible for the prizes and for the rest of the hackathon. And also a reminder on our last topic that you can follow both Emily and Farah on Twitter, and I highly encourage it. So thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you later.